Hey y'all, I'm Lewis. For today's video, I made a fully functional Buster Sword. And by fully functional, I mean you can actually play Final Fantasy 7 Remake with a Buster Sword controller. Also, as a side bonus, this Buster Sword controller works on other games like Elden Ring, but I can barely beat the first few levels of Final Fantasy Remake with the sword, so there's no way I'm getting past Margit. As for the Buster Sword itself, let's talk about how one really bad idea turned into a really heavy bad idea. I don't know about y'all, but when I was a kid, me and my friends used to pretend to do the wind poses from our favorite games. Despite not knowing what the hell a Final Fantasy was, you could sure bet as kids we love big ass swords. Well, fast forward about 20 years and that dumb kid at the playground is now a dumb adult with a little more free time. Last year I prototyped a build on Twitter to see if I could make a childhood dream a reality. The prototype did work, but the build itself was really bad. Honestly, I just kinda slapped on electronics to a cosplay prop and did some motion controls. For starters, the wiring on the project was more exposed than Twitch's source code at the time. Another major problem was that the hilt of the Buster Sword was way too small to fit any joysticks or buttons. This was a very common problem when I was looking for Buster Sword as a mod for my project. Most of the Buster Sword props I found were either too small or too brittle to withstand any of the tests I want to do. I wanted a Buster Sword that I could swing around and when it ran into things it didn't break. So the only option I had left was to build my own Buster Sword, and I have some really bad news for everybody. Y'all, I'm a programmer, not an artist. My crafting skills are so boo-boo garbage, I'm surprised this project turned out pretty okay. First I had to make a prototype so I could start testing the motion controls. It would be a really bad idea to solder the electronics on without understanding how much the blade's gonna weigh. First thing I did was get some insulation foam and powdered out a Buster Sword. To make sure the sword doesn't explode in one swing, I have a PVC pipe in the middle to hold the sword together. And after a couple weekends of sanding and breathing in insulation foam, we finally got the build to a testing phase. Also, quick side note, I did get asked a couple times what kind of hardware I use for my builds, and here it is. The base of the build is an Arduino, which I still don't know how to pronounce correctly, but it has some joysticks and buttons so you can play the game normally. There's also a second Arduino that has an MPU 6050 in it, which has an accelerometer and gyroscope. That's the part of the build that handles all the math for the motion controls. A good way to describe this build to someone is that it's a really bad Wiimote. Once the prototype was ready, I asked the most important question for the build. Does it work on Final Fantasy 14? And what better class to test a controller on than the Dark Knight? On the bright side, the motion controls work just fine, so there's nothing wrong with the software. However, this version of the Buster Sword sucks eggs. The wires are fed through the PVC pipe to connect to the joysticks and buttons, which is really nice. But if there's even one issue with the wiring, it's going to be a nightmare to fix with this setup. So I went with plan 2, which is 3D printing our own sword along with the housing for the hardware. The base of the Buster Sword print is actually a modified version of Dangerous Lady's 3D print file. This is not an ad, but Dangerous Lady's 3D print files were so easy to work with, I had to shout them out. To make sure my hardware didn't compromise the build, I had to custom make my own hilt. This might look like a really weird Nerf toy shotgun, but I can explain. I created some small grooves and panels on the hilt so I can hide the buttons and joysticks in them. Overall, the build's about 5 foot 4 inches long and it weighs about 8 to 10 pounds, which I found out recently that's a little heavy for a sword. It took about a week to print out the build and a couple more weekends of sanding and wood filling to clean it up. And I must have did a pretty decent job because I got a ton of comments asking if it was metal and it looked really good. And as someone who's really bad at crafting, to see all these really cool comments made me feel really good, so thank you. But enough of this nerd talk, let's do some jock things and talk about the motion controls of the build. Basic attacks were really easy to program as I took the data from swinging the sword and converted it to pressing the X button. Whenever you swing the sword, it spikes the value of the velocity in the Y-axis, so it was really easy to detect on my side. One new feature is that if you swing the sword a little too hard, it will activate the button twice. And honestly, I'm not going to punish you for swinging this big ass sword incorrectly, so I'm leaving this in. Up next, we have the guarding motion, which was one of my favorite things to figure out. Long story short, the Buster Sword checks to see if it's at an angle within a threshold similar to how Cloud holds it in game. I made the threshold really strict to make sure you're trying to guard in real life and not accidentally just moving the sword around. Also, if you want to be a brave soul and try to swing after a guard stance, don't worry, I made a function allow it to happen. This move is so hard to pull off, I wanted to make sure it still worked no matter how dumb I look doing it. Last but not least, I even programmed motions for abilities like focus thrust. Holding the Buster Sword horizontally will start the process. If you hold down the green button and do the thrust motion, it will activate the macro for whatever's in the L1 triangle shortcut slot. In this case, it was mapped to focus thrust, which was really fun to do. The one thing I didn't like about this build was how long it took to QA this thing. I spent hours, and I mean hours, swinging the Buster Sword around and sweating my ass off every night. There were some nights where I stopped after 30 minutes of testing because the sword was a little too heavy for me. One of my favorite things things about this build is that it's just a regular controller, so I can pretty much play anything I want with it. I did mention earlier that this build does work with Elden Ring, right? What if there was a certain greatsword that was really cool to use under a certain moonlight?